Today in the Daily Dose, Hitler invades Poland. On September 1st, 1939, under the command of Adolf Hitler, Germany launched a coordinated attack on Poland from the west, south, and north, in clear violation of the post-World War I Treaty of Versailles, Treaty of Locarno, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact intended to maintain peace in Europe. Employing Hitler's Blitzkrieg or lightning war strategy, the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe at first laid down an extensive bombing campaign to destroy Poland's air and rail infrastructure, along with communication lines and munition dumps, before deploying a massive land invasion by troops, tanks, and artillery, incapacitating resistance as they pushed across the country. Although Poland fronted a 1 million-man army, antiquated equipment coupled with outmoded thinking by Polish commanders, who chose to take the Germans head-on instead of falling back to more geographically defensible positions, in the end proving to be no match for Germany's modern mechanized forces. Civilian resistance remained defiant throughout the early days of Hitler's Blitzkrieg, with citizens in Warsaw engaging in guerrilla-style warfare tactics, leading to a German bombing campaign that left 95% of the city destroyed before Warsaw's surrender on September 28th of that same year. All hope of salvation vanished after the Soviets signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov Non-Aggression Pact with Germany, which further intensified the suffering inflicted on the Poles. On September 3rd, Great Britain and France declared war against Germany, effectively marking the start of the Second World War, at the same time prompting England to respond on the same day with bombing raids over Germany. As the Nazis deepened their hold over Poland, Hitler established operational bases that employed SS Death's Head regiments intent on annihilating any Poles who opposed his Nazi ideology, quickly establishing concentration camps to house slave laborers and to exterminate Jews and political dissidents. Hitler's invasion of Poland also demonstrated the impotence of the League of Nations and the collapse of its collective security system, setting off one of the darkest periods in recent human history, while taking the lives of an estimated 45 million people. Sinking the SS Athenia. Launched in 1923, the British passenger liner SS Athenia sailed under the Donaldson Atlantic Line with transatlantic accommodations for 1,000 passengers, and on the evening of September 1st, 1939, the same day Germany invaded Poland, the SS Athenia departed Glasgow, Scotland for Montreal, Canada, with a cargo of 1,103 relieved passengers, desperate to flee yet another war in Europe. Making stops in Belfast and Liverpool to take on additional passengers, on September 3rd, mere hours after British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain declared a state of war with Germany, at 7:30 p.m., the 26-year-old captain of U-30, Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp, gave the order to fire upon the unarmed passenger liner. During the slow 14-hour sinking of the SS Athenia, the HMS Electra and 2 other destroyers were able to rescue the majority of the passengers and crew aboard the doomed ocean liner, save for 93 passengers, including 85 women and children, and 19 crew members, who were either lost in the initial explosion or died in mishandled lifeboats, making the SS Athenia the first British ship to go down in the Second World War. As the youngest captain in the Third Reich's Kriegsmarine, Lemp had been trained to observe the German Navy's prize rules based on international law, which required U-boat commanders to forewarn merchant vessels of an impending attack. Instead, Lemp would later claim that the SS Athenia had been acting suspiciously, employing zigzag defensive maneuvers with her portholes blacked out. Soon after his order to fire upon the passenger ship, Lemp would discover the truth behind his blunder by listening to a BBC broadcast, further compounding his mistake by extending his patrol for an additional 3 more weeks. After Lemp returned to base to confess in private to Kriegsmarine Commodore Karl Dönitz, Dönitz and other German war leaders accepted the fact that Lemp may have made an egregious error under the heat of battle, furthering their cover-up by crudely inserting a fake page into the U-30's logbook regarding Lemp's report of events on September 3rd. Not only did Lemp avoid court-martial for disobeying orders, but the German Navy awarded the aggressive submariner with the Iron Cross Second-Class Medal and a promotion to lieutenant commander. Lemp later took the helm of U-110, which in May of 1941 was attacked by British warships and forced to the surface. While Lemp went down with his ship, his surviving crew failed to scuttle their badly damaged U-boat, allowing a still-functional Enigma cipher machine to fall into Allied hands, a turning point moment which later allowed the Allies to intercept and decipher German radio commands, making the sinking of SS Athenia the first innocent maritime casualties in a long and bloody war. The Mid-Atlantic Gap. During the early years of the Second World War, before the Allies had deciphered the Germans' Enigma code or developed air-to-surface radar, Hitler's U-boats wreaked havoc on North America's ability to resupply the British with desperately needed war assets and basic supplies. Known respectively as the Mid-Atlantic Gap, the Greenland Gap, the Black Pit, or simply the Gap, by the fall of 1942, some 2,000 ships had been lost to German U-boat attacks, who hunted in groups known as wolf packs, sending thousands of merchant seamen to unmarked graves in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. Losing more ships than Allied shipyards could produce, Allied war leaders saw the writing on the wall. Without an effective stop to the U-boat threat, Great Britain would be forced to sue for peace under the relentless vice of Nazi aggression. Emboldened by their early success in the Mid-Atlantic Gap and fully aware that they could win the war by cutting off Britain's vital supply chain, the situation worsened in May of 1942 when a swarm of German U-boats entered the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the inland waters of the St. Lawrence River, sinking 21 ships with relative ease. Using a strategy born in World War I, merchant ships formed massive convoys before steaming across the 1,000-mile Mid-Atlantic Gap, escorted by Allied naval warships who kept a vigilant eye out for marauding U-boats. Even so, losses remained egregiously high until Allied ingenuity combined with its tactical, industrial, and technological might to crush the U-boat threat once and for all. In early 1943, the Allies established air bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, and Greenland in an effort to extend air support over the gap, at the same time employing long-range bombers like the B-24 Liberator, equipped with first-of-its-kind air-to-surface radar systems, which could penetrate the perpetual fog over the Grand Banks that gave U-boats their early advantage. Increased reconnaissance and anti-submarine patrols, combined with advances in anti-sub warfare techniques, employing sonar and new depth charge systems, severely biting into the Germans' ability to sink Allied ships, which ultimately closed the Mid-Atlantic Gap by May of 1943, making victory over the Black Pit a crucial turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic and ultimately the eventual outcome of the Second World War. Convoys of the Second World War. Sinking some 5,000 merchant ships at a cost of an approximate 15,000 Allied lives, Germany's formidable U-boat fleet nearly brought Great Britain to her knees during the early years of the First World War, forcing merchant and naval vessels to band together to move desperately needed war material and fighting men across the Atlantic and other formidable oceans. The Allies also employed Q-ships, which were lifelike decoys designed to draw U-boats into unsuspecting traps for ambush and destruction. Nearing the end of the war, Germany developed even longer-range U-boats that threatened shipping off the east coast of the United States, sinking 13 ships off the coast of Florida in May of 1918 alone, prompting Congress and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to develop the Intercoastal Waterway System in 1924 for the protection of ships in the event of future world wars. After Japan's unprovoked attack on American naval assets at Pearl Harbor, by the dawn of 1942, the U.S. Navy had only 81 ships to help the Allies fend off the growing U-boat menace, prompting German Admiral Karl Dönitz to ramp up wolfpack attacks on Allied shipping. Resuming the convoy tactics of World War I, merchant and naval vessels formed up into fast convoys versus slower ones, consisting of 45 to 60 ships on average, although the largest during the war made up some 166 ships. Steaming in 9 to 12 columns with 1,000 yards between columns and 600 yards between ships, due to their inherent vulnerabilities, oilers and munition ships were placed in the innermost columns, with the convoy Commodore, as he was known, as the lead ship in the center column. The convoy system also maximized the efficiency of shipping operations, wherein ships within a convoy could share resources such as fuel and supplies, making the overall transportation process more sustainable. Fast convoys usually zigzagged to complicate a U-boat's targeting abilities, while slower convoys usually steamed straight ahead in the interest of speed. By May of 1943, however, anti-submarine warfare techniques had turned the hunters into the hunted, including improvements in radar, sonar, radio direction finders, magnetic detection equipment, anti-homing torpedo devices, and hedgehog depth charges, leading to an Allied victory during the Battle of the Atlantic. Despite their ultimate success, the Allies paid an extremely high price for victory, losing 3,500 merchant ships and 175 warships by the time of Japan's surrender, making convoys of World War II one of the most instrumental tactics of the Second World War. Miracle at Dunkirk. In late April of 1940, as Britain struggled for survival against relentless Nazi aggression, Germany began its invasion of the Low Countries, prompting French and British forces to move into Belgium to repel the attack. In classic diversionary blitzkrieg fashion, German forces then smashed through the Allies' weak point in the Ardennes, effectively surrounding Allied forces at the French port of Dunkirk, their backs desperately pinned to the English Channel. By May 19th, as the Nazis charged across Belgium, they cut off all communication and transport links between the northern and southern branches of the Allied force, prompting Winston Churchill to weigh the odds of an evacuation in light of certain annihilation of the hundreds of thousands of men now trapped at Dunkirk. In response, Operation Dynamo began on May 26 under the direction of Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, with bleak expectations of evacuating no more than 45,000 troops. Instead, a confluence of good fortune led to the successful evacuation of some 338,000 men as they clung to the beachhead under constant bombardment by the still dominant Luftwaffe. Aided by 800 to 1,200 vessels, including leisure and fishing crafts manned primarily by British naval personnel, the unusually gentle weather conditions allowed small boats to pick up men in minimal surf conditions before ferrying them out to larger vessels. A second saving grace was Ramsay's creative use of Dunkirk's harbor mole or breakwater, which allowed larger ships to onboard men at a much faster pace, while Hitler's halt order to his advancing troops gave the Allies a merciful reprieve from what Churchill called a miracle of deliverance. Fully expecting a frosty reception on their defeated homecoming, publicly vilified with their tail between their legs, instead, the rescued men found themselves welcomed home like heroes, all at a time when Great Britain was in desperate need of a major morale boost, a little more than a month before their fight for survival in the Battle of Britain. Given the vast amount of equipment and weaponry left behind at Dunkirk, some historians believe that the loss of so many war assets left Britain open for immediate invasion by Nazi forces, had the Germans had the plans or will or ability to advance on England, making the miracle at Dunkirk a vital morale boost to a nation's dogged sense of freedom. George S. Patton. Born into a family of distinguished military heroes, George S. Patton became convinced at a young age that his fate lay in perpetuating the family legacy of valorous achievements. Raised in a loving home, in later years, Patton remembered his father reading the Iliad and the Odyssey to him at 7 years of age. Dyslexic from birth, Patton was a 5-year undistinguished student at West Point, although his athleticism saw him compete in the 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm. Patton saw his first combat in the Mexican War of 1916 before leading a tank brigade in World War I in 2 major actions, although his ultimate preeminence came during World War II, where his exceptional leadership and tactical skills played a crucial role in the Allies' victory in both the North African and European theaters, where he once proclaimed that the object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other bastard die for his. Of his many achievements on the field of battle, Patton led the U.S. 7th Army to key victories over the German Afrika Korps before applying his aggressive style during the Allied invasion of Sicily and southern Italy, where his heavy reliance on tank warfare would shape military strategy well into the future. His leadership style and strategic brilliance reached its zenith during the Germans' last-ditch counteroffensive at the 1944 Battle of the Bulge, where his rapid response and audacious strategies relieved pressure on besieged Allied soldiers at the town of Bastogne. On the downside, however, he once slapped a soldier suffering from combat fatigue, while on March 25, 1945, he sent 307 men 25 miles behind enemy lines to free his son-in-law from an officer prisoner of war camp near Hammelburg, Germany, costing the lives of nearly 300 Allied soldiers when Wehrmacht forces encircled the task force, an egregious failure soon overlooked by the press due to the passing of FDR on April 12, 1945. Considered by most historians to be a Jekyll and Hyde personality, according to historian Stephen J. Zalaga, Patton's main intellectual weakness was that he was overwhelmingly self-centered, who often viewed the world as an extension of himself. One minute he could be a fire-breathing autocrat, lashing out at his subordinates. The next minute a maudlin sentimentalist, crying at the sight of wounded soldiers in a field hospital. He died tragically in a car crash on December 21, 1945, at 60 years of age. Yet his legacy lives on for his strategic brilliance, relentless pursuit of victory, and his lasting influence on armored mechanized warfare. The Battle of Britain. After the Germans had rapidly overwhelmed France and the Low Countries of Europe, the Nazis set their sights on the overthrow of Great Britain. Heralded as the first major military campaign fought entirely by air forces, the Battle of Britain ignited on July 10, 1940, before terrorizing the British for the next nearly 4 months to come. Fought between the German Luftwaffe, the British Royal Air Force, and the British Navy's Fleet Air Army, Hitler's primary objective for the campaign was to compel Britain to agree to a negotiated peace settlement, targeting coastal shipping convoys, ports, and shipping centers such as Portsmouth. On August 1st, the Luftwaffe was directed to achieve air superiority over the RAF, with the aim of incapacitating the RAF Fighter Command. 12 days later, it shifted their attacks to RAF airfields and infrastructure, which included the attempted destruction of British aircraft production facilities. After both German objectives failed, the Nazis shifted their focus to terror bombing raids over British cities, hoping that the resultant public outcry and political pressure would force politicians to capitulate. On July 16, 1940, Hitler ordered that preparations be made for Operation Sea Lion, which was the planned amphibious and airborne assault on Great Britain. In September, however, the RAF Bomber Command disrupted the Nazis' invasion plans during a series of punishing night raids on a flotilla of converted barges being outfitted for the coastal invasion of Britain. Combined with the Luftwaffe's failure to gain air superiority over the Brits, Hitler abruptly canceled all plans for Operation Sea Lion. Historian Stephen Bungay cited Germany's failure to destroy Britain's air defenses as the first major German defeat in World War II, while injecting a crucial turning point in the conflict in Europe. The Battle of Britain takes its name from a speech given by Prime Minister Winston Churchill to the House of Commons on June 18, 1940, when he said, "When General Weygand called the Battle of France over, I suspect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin." The Battle of Britain would see 1,964 airmen casualties for the British, while the Germans suffered casualties of 4,245. 14,286 British civilians were killed during the 4-month running campaign, while an additional 20,325 British civilians were wounded. Despite these egregious losses, the victory in favor of Britain provided an enormous morale boost for the nation, emboldening their confidence that they could and would successfully defend themselves from Nazi aggression. R-Day. After Hitler's 1939 invasion of Poland and the Nazis' subsequent blitzkrieg invasions across Europe, an American nation once divided over the issue of isolationism versus intervention began to realize that the later was inevitable, given the clear good against evil reflection of unprovoked Axis aggression. As a result, on October 16, 1940, all American men between the ages of 21 and 35 were required to register for the nation's first peacetime selective service draft on what became known as R-Day.
You have the confidence and the gratitude and the love of your countrymen. We are all with you in the task which enlists the services of all Americans, the task of keeping the peace in this new world of ours.
The level of patriotic cooperation became instantly notable, as rich and poor, famous and unheralded, lined up as one at registration centers across the nation. 113,000 men queued up at 47 registration centers in the District of Columbia, despite the misery of a pounding cold rain. 500,000 queued in Chicago, where examiners asked each man a dozen questions, noting a registrant's build as slender, medium, or stout, while recording a registrant's race as white, Negro, Oriental, Indian, or Filipino. Each man was handed a wallet-sized draft card that quickly became a form of valid identification as a man's legal or illegal status for the purchase of alcohol. Journalists followed the registration of famous actors, athletes, and financiers, including John Wayne, Henry Fonda, Don Amici, and heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis, who made the front page of most national newspapers the following morning under the caption, "He's a fighter for you, Uncle Sam." As the day wore on, 500 World War I veterans delivered a 10-gallon fishbowl into Philadelphia's Independence Hall, the same one used during the World War I draft of 1919, where a blindfolded Secretary of War Henry Stimson, pulled celluloid capsules from the fishbowl before handing them one by one to FDR. The first number drawn was 158, and while many American men were drafted into the military with each successive lottery draw, the lingering effects of the Great Depression witnessed more than 71,000 unemployed American men volunteer for military service during the early weeks of the draft, hoping for training in future careers ranging from cooks to mechanics to pilots, making Registration Day a defining step toward America's eventual entry into the Second World War. Operation Barbarossa. After Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in August of 1939, replete with secret plans to divide Czechoslovakia upon Germany's planned invasion, on June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German and Axis troops invaded Russia along an 1,800-mile front, shooting down more than 1,000 Soviet aircraft on the first day alone. Codenamed Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's plan called for the genocidal elimination of Russians and Ukrainians from their homelands, creating his envisioned Lebensraum, or living space, for the future growth of his supposedly genetically superior German race. Despite the arrival across his borders of the most powerful invasion force in the history of human warfare, some 80% of all Wehrmacht assets, Stalin and his Red Army were caught flat-footed and unprepared, as Panzer tank divisions and Luftwaffe bombardments gave Germany an early lead against the Soviets' numerous yet poorly trained troops. Moving with the same blitzkrieg speed that saw every nation but Great Britain fall in less than 6 weeks' time, advancing German forces were followed by SS death squads known as Einsatzgruppen, who sought out and killed Russian civilians with a particular emphasis on Soviet Jews, while Hitler's Commissar order authorized the immediate execution of all Soviet prisoners of war, in direct violation of international war protocols like the Geneva Convention. German forces also met with heavy casualties, as the Soviets' numerical advantage and stiff civilian resistance took its toll on the Wehrmacht. Halting his attack on Moscow against protests from his generals, Hitler ordered his forces into resource-rich Ukraine, which fell to the Nazis by the end of September 1941. After cutting Leningrad off from the rest of Russia, when his forces proved insufficient to take the city itself, Hitler ordered a siege of starvation, which would last for some 872 days. Launching a second offensive against Moscow in early October of 1941, Hitler's delay gave the Soviets time to strengthen the city's defenses, while the winter quagmire season, known as Rasputitsa, halted German forces 12 miles from the city, before Red Army reinforcements from Siberia forced the Germans into a full-scale retreat. Considered one of the greatest early failures of Hitler's aggression in Europe, his reliance on a quick victory collapsed under inadequate supply lines, frigid weather, and harsh terrain, making Operation Barbarossa an early fail for Nazi Germany. Ernie Pyle, America's eyewitness to war. Unquestionably the most famous and beloved American war correspondent of World War II, Ernie Pyle's distinctive folksy writing style brought the horrors of war into living rooms throughout the United States. Embedded with frontline troops in the European theater of operations from 1942 to 1944, Pyle wrote about ordinary dog-faced infantry soldiers, which he called the underdogs of World War II. Through his heroic reporting, Pyle became friends with enlisted men and officers alike, as well as war leaders such as Omar Bradley and Dwight D. Eisenhower. After returning stateside to shake off a severe case of battle fatigue, Pyle returned to the trenches in 1945, this time in the Pacific Theater of Operations. reinforcing his status as the dog-faced GI's best friend. Pyle wrote a column from Italy in 1944, proposing that soldiers in combat should get fight pay, just as airmen receive flight pay. In May 1944, Congress passed a law that became known as the Ernie Pyle Bill, authorizing 50% extra pay for combat service. Syndicated in over 400 daily and 300 weekly newspapers, his most famous column was the death of Captain Wascow, when he was reporting from Anzio during the invasion of Italy. "I don't know who that first dead man was," he wrote. "You feel small in the presence of dead men, and ashamed at being alive, and you don't ask silly questions." He further wrote that as dead soldiers were brought down a mountain from the front lines, one of them that was laid out in the dim moonlight was much beloved Captain Henry Wascow of the 36th Infantry Division. Pyle wrote, "Then a soldier came and stood beside the officer and bent over, and he too spoke to the dead captain, not in a whisper but awfully tenderly, and he said, 'I sure am sorry, sir.' Then the first man squatted down, and he reached down and took the dead man's hand, and he sat there for a full 5 minutes, holding the dead hand in his own and looking intently into the dead face, and he never uttered a sound all the time he sat there. And finally he put the hand down, and then he reached up and gently straightened the points of the captain's shirt collar, and then he sort of rearranged the tattered edges of the uniform around the wound, and then he got up and walked away down the road in the moonlight, all alone." When Pyle was killed during the Battle of Okinawa, April 14, 1945, President Harry S. Truman said of the gutsy reporter, "No man in this war has so well told the story of the American fighting man as American fighting men wanted it told. He deserves the gratitude of all his countrymen." Pyle's wife Jerry would die later that same year from complications of influenza. The Nazis' use of performance-enhancing drugs. In his best-selling German-language book, which translates as Total Russian English, author Norman Ohler presents irrefutable evidence of regular drug use by Adolf Hitler, as well as many in the Nazi high command and soldiers of the Wehrmacht armed forces. After Ohler discovered detailed records left by Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician, Ohler discovered that the use of methamphetamine or crystal meth was a widely used drug of choice throughout the Nazi war machine, which allowed Wehrmacht soldiers to stay awake for days on end while marching endless miles without rest. Developed by Temmler Pharmaceutical Company of Berlin, Pervitin was first introduced in 1938, marketed as a magic pill for alertness and energy, prompting military doctor Otto Ranke to dose 90 college students with the drug, concluding that the widespread use of Pervitin would help Germany win the war. In response, after the so-called stimulant decree of April 1940, Pervitin was distributed by the millions to Wehrmacht troops, where the drug fueled the Nazis' 1940 blitzkrieg into France through the Ardennes Mountains. Nor were the Nazis alone in using performance-enhancing drugs, since other records point to widespread use of Benzedrine or speed by Allied soldiers, intended to overcome battle fatigue during long engagements in the field. Not all the Nazis took every drug, Ohler clarified in an interview, since others like Hermann Göring used much stronger drugs than Pervitin, giving him the nickname Moring for his steady use of morphine. Morell's notes further reveal that the doctor injected Hitler some 800 times over the war years, including amphetamines, barbiturates, and Eucadol, which was the German brand name for the synthetic opiate oxycodone. Later in the war, as things began to go badly for the Nazis and their Axis brethren, Morell injected Hitler with Eucadol before a key meeting with Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, while in the spring of 1945, shortly before Hitler's death by suicide, Morell's records indicate that the Fuhrer was most likely deep into oxycodone withdrawal due to Morell's inability to access the drug in the bombed-out destruction of Greater Berlin, giving new meaning to the definition of blitzed in the Nazis' offensive strategy of blitzkrieg. Pearl Harbor. After years of imposed trade sanctions by the United States in response to Japan's expansionist aggression in China and Southeast Asia, the Empire of Japan came to the conclusion that the only way to increase their influence in the region was to take out the Americans' Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. After months of planning and practice, at 8 a.m. Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, Japanese warplanes filled the sky over Honolulu, wreaking havoc on the Americans' idle and unsuspecting Pacific Fleet. At 8:10, an 1,800-pound bomb careened through the forward deck of the USS Arizona, exploding an ammunition magazine before sending 1,000 sailors to a watery grave. Just as the Arizona slipped beneath the surface, torpedoes fired by two-man Japanese subs took out the battleship USS Oklahoma, which in turn rolled onto her side with 400 sailors on board. The two-wave attack by 353 Japanese warplanes was over in less than 2 hours, crippling or destroying nearly 19 American ships and more than 188 aircraft, taking the lives of 2,403 sailors, soldiers, and civilians, while wounding an additional 1,178 people. Fortunately for the Americans, all of her Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers were out to sea at the time of the attack, some which had returned to the mainland, while others were delivering warplanes to troops stationed on Midway and Wake Islands. A secondary plus was that the Japanese attack failed to damage the Americans' vital onshore facilities, such as oil storage tanks, repair shops, shipyards, and submarine pens, which allowed the American Navy to rebound relatively quickly after the attack. Within 6 months, 5 battleships and 2 cruisers were patched and refloated so that they could be sent to shipyards in Pearl Harbor or on the west coast of the United States. Intensive salvage operations continued for another year, witnessing a total of some 20,000 man-hours by underwater divers. A day later, at the beginning of a speech to Congress requesting a declaration of war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered a speech which still resonates within the collective minds of Americans.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
On December 8, 1941, the United States Congress declared war on the Empire of Japan, officially entering World War II in both the Pacific and European theaters of war, which would ultimately result in the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Axis nations, followed by Japan's surrender after nuclear bomb detonations over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All told, during the 5+ years of World War II, 70 to 85 million people would lose their lives to the madness of war. Friendly fire casualties at Pearl Harbor. After years of imposed trade sanctions by the United States, in response to Japan's expansionist aggression in China and Southeast Asia, the Empire of Japan came to the conclusion that the only way to increase their influence in the region was to take out the Americans' Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. After months of planning and practice, at 8 a.m. Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, Japanese warplanes filled the sky over Honolulu, wreaking havoc on the Americans' idle and unsuspecting Pacific Fleet warships. The two-wave attack by 353 Japanese warplanes was over in less than 2 hours, crippling or destroying nearly 19 American ships and more than 188 aircraft, taking the lives of 2,403 sailors and soldiers, while wounding an additional 1,178 more. During the attack, to heap misfortune upon misfortune, a day earlier, the Navy had undertaken a large-scale air defense exercise before giving anti-aircraft battery crews town leave beginning on the evening of December 6, leaving the defense of Pearl Harbor in the hands of 5-inch naval guns, which were designed to engage surface targets rather than Japanese dive bombers. During the heat of battle, both time fuse and contact artillery shells took over the role of Honolulu's idled anti-aircraft batteries, and while 55 Japanese airmen were killed during the attack, civilian casualties in Honolulu and elsewhere took direct hits by the fuselage of shells that missed enemy targets and landed in the streets surrounding Pearl Harbor. 32 people died in Honolulu during the attack, including a 3-month-old baby, while another 36 civilians were killed in other communities surrounding the harbor, including Japanese-American restaurateur Chitsuo Hirosaki, who was killed instantly when a 55-pound shell exploded inside his diner. 3 of his children were killed in the explosion, along with their 14-year-old cousin and 7 young men who just happened to be eating breakfast. A day later, at the beginning of his speech to Congress requesting a declaration of war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered a speech which still resonates within the collective minds of Americans, making friendly fire casualties at Pearl Harbor yet another tragic loss of life during the insanity of war. America enters World War II. As more than 2,000 American soldiers and sailors lay dead among the burned ruins of Pearl Harbor's battleships, planes, and airfields, President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that there could be but one response.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Less than 24 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress, delivering an impassioned oratorical display that demanded a declaration of war against Japan.
The unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Within an hour after his speech, Roosevelt had his declaration of war. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, who in turn declared war on all Axis powers. Across the nation, young men poured into recruiting stations, eager to stick it to the enemy. Hollywood became a contributing propaganda arm, stirring the fires of patriotism with movies promoting the war effort.
Don't kid yourself. The doc says I'm in perfect shape.
That's the stuff, Harry. Stick around. I'll be right with you.
You mean you're joining up?
Well, sure. They can't keep me out now. Next!
Women joined the workforce, famously led by Rosie the Riveter. By early 1942, America implemented a rationing system, everything from rubber to gasoline, butter and bread. Leisure time was slashed dramatically as a nation came together to build the machines necessary for an Allied victory.
We are now in this war. We're all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history.
On December 8, 1941, the United States joined a war that by its very breadth and scope would cost the lives of 60 million people, while ultimately excising a gruesome evil. At war's end, 4 long years later, life in America and around the world would never be the same. Today in the Daily Dose, high-score U.S. submarines of World War II. During the Second World War, the U.S. Navy employed 263 submarines on war patrols, claiming 1,392 enemy ships totaling 5,583,400 tons, effectively depriving Axis forces of critical manpower, assets, and supplies. Of the top 3 most lethal subs of the U.S. Navy, the Belau-class Tang led the list of the Navy's most lethal and effective subcrews, sinking 33 enemy ships for a total of 116,454 tons. Launched in 1943, the Tang's short but deadly career ended on October 24, 1944, when she was sunk in 180 feet of water in the Taiwan Strait by an enemy torpedo, taking the lives of 78 men. The Gatto-class Flasher was launched from Groton, Connecticut in June of 1943, surviving 6 patrols during the remainder of the war, while sinking 21 ships for a total of 100,231 Japanese tons. Receiving the Presidential Unit Citation and 6 battle stars, the Flasher displaced 1,525 tons on the surface, while her submerged displacement was 2,424 tons. With an overall length of 311 feet 9 inches and a beam of 27 feet 3 inches, the Thrasher's 4 massive General Electric V16 diesel engines could propel her to a top speed on the surface of 21 knots and a submerged speed of 9 knots. Crewed by 6 officers and 54 enlisted sailors, the Thrasher was decommissioned in March of 1946 before being sold for scrap in 1963. Third on the list of most deadly American subs was the Gatto-class Rasher, claiming 18 ships with a near matching tonnage as the Flasher at 99,901 tons. Launched in Manitowoc, Wisconsin in December of 1942, the Rasher served 8 patrols in the Pacific Theater, earning a Presidential Unit Citation and 7 battle stars. Matching the Flasher's specifications, the Rasher had a range of 11,000 miles and remained in service after the end of the war, serving as a radar picket from 1953 to 1960, while her service in the Vietnam War earned her the Vietnam Service Medal and 2 service stars, making the top-scoring U.S. submarines of World War II some of the gutsiest combat crews in U.S. naval history. And there you have it, high-kill subs of World War II, today in the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com.